Hello, you've reached Lisa Talking again, and we're in the next of our regular Sunday history series, looking at the history of what we in the West euphemistically call the Silk Roads. So that's the history of the economic, trading and political relationships between West and East. But in actual fact, the boundary between West and East doesn't really appear until the 1st century, and the roots of our economic nervous system are much, much deeper than that. So, last week I discussed the political engine that was established in the territory around the Jordan Valley that we call modern-day Israel, Jordan and Syria. And I discussed how the geography of the Jordan Valley had been used to establish a political engine where one half of it, one side of the valley, the land called Canaan or modern-day Israel, was established to protect the other side of the valley, which contained a site called Kadesh, Mount Sin, Holy Mountain, which is currently evidenced at the ruins at Petra in the modern-day country of Jordan. And what I said was that this political engine, with a sacred complex at its core, with a harem structure where powerful women from multiple civilizations would operate, with a tribal governance system, and with a trading oasis, would go on to become a political engine which shaped pretty much every subsequent layer of civilization that I was going to discuss in this series. And what I said was that this engine had come into being as part of a process during a period of Mesopotamian history where a dynasty, a very successful dynasty called the Third Dynasty of Ur, a monarch called Shulgi of Ur, who's known in Abrahamic traditions as Shem, had established this as Holy Mountain initially as a challenge to another site, Mari, which is on the modern-day Iraq-Syria border. And I explained how the instability that was generated by the disintegration of the Third Dynasty and the conflicts that it generated on the Fertile Crescent actually resulted in this city that he had established being consolidated within the stories of Abraham and Sarah in the Bible by a Hyksos king called Sakiha, whose wife was the last high priestess of Ur and who also married a pharaoh's daughter. And he had consolidated their power at this site to actually make it a real city of peace in a period of instability which had rocked the Fertile Crescent as a consequence of the Third Dynasty of Ur, led to the city of Ur falling, and which which also included instability in Egypt as a real city of peace. Now, this political engine continues to exist, and we're going to talk a bit about its development today and in a lot of other videos, but it exists alongside, like, basically the economic center of the antique world, like the first financial center, like, really. And what we're going to talk about today is the civilizations of Egypt and Nubia. Now, I often say that geography drives history, and that is nowhere more true than this territory we're going to discuss. Now, in the West, and in modern world, we're used to looking at kind of the Egyptian civilization almost in isolation, partially because of the Western archaeological fascination with Egyptology, and partially because of the availability of artifacts. So we are reliant often on Egyptian sources for information about the civilizations around it and the roots of Egyptian history, and we're now coming to a point in history where we're re-examining, finding out it's a lot more complex than this. And in actual fact, this is very much the economic center of the world for a very, very, very long time. Now, geography does indeed drive history, and when I described the creation of this political engine in the Jordan Valley, I discussed the way that the Dead Sea and the Galilee were connected by the Jordan River, and that the geography of this valley had allowed these people to create this political engine that would kind of fulfill this function for a long time. Now, if you follow this waterway all the way down, you will meet a sea called the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea is a strip of a very narrow waterway. It's only about 30 kilometers wide at many points. And it goes directly down to the Indian Ocean, and it forms the barrier between the Arabian Peninsula and what we would call modern-day Egypt, or the continent of Africa. Now, this is a very important waterway. So through this waterway, you can get directly up to the Levant, you can get to the Arabian Peninsula, you can get to Africa and what we would consider modern-day Egypt. And parallel to this waterway, there runs a river called the Nile, which we've all heard of, which we know the stable tides of this river form the basis of Egypt's agricultural economy in the civilization that we understand. Now, the Nile is a very, very long river. And if you look at historians concerned with kind of later periods, they will divide it into Upper and Lower Egypt and then Upper and Lower Nubia. And they'll also divide it into what they call cataracts, which are just places where the river course changes slightly. I think usually because of kind of rocky outcrops or whatever. Now, when you're in the northern hemisphere, like I'm from the northern hemisphere, and when I look at a map and I see a river, I assume it's going to run downwards, and I kind of trace geography from there. But with the Nile, it's in the southern hemisphere, so it actually runs upwards, and then it fans at the top, and it looks like a flower or a lotus tree, and it fans as tributaries into the Mediterranean. So already, geographically, you've got two waterways that link the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Now, this is very important. We discussed in the original video about Neolithic China, the tandem development of Chinese civilization and Indus Valley civilization. So this is already a very early, important geographical point. But what makes this territory the most important territory in the antique world is gold. Now, Nubia is a word with the word gold at its root. Now, generally, in ancient artifacts, when you're looking for information about this civilization, you're looking for words like Tasseti, which means bow people, because they were also people who had to have a military capability. They were very skilled archers. But this area was the source of the antique world's gold. This is the source of Rome's gold supplies. This is literally the economic and financial center of the antique world, because they have a gold in abundance. When other civilizations are making items out of copper in early civilization, they're using gold. Now, there is not a civilization in the world who has not valued gold. It was even our gold standard in modern economies until not as long ago as you might think. The Indus Valley civilization have highly crafted gold artifacts 4,000-5,000 years ago. And so this is shaping this geography to way before what we consider the roots of the Egyptian identity. Now, we don't know how old this civilization is. There are footprints on the Arabian Peninsula that are 120,000 years old. We know that there is trade of cattle coming from Western Asia, goats and sheep, 7,500 years ago. There's stone circles, the Nabta Playa, which is kind of 7,500 years ago. So we do not know how old this civilization is at all. But we do know that there are a combination of nomadic people and people who, like I said, I don't know what the word is, like static, who grow up around the river, civilizations who, civilization follows those patterns of development. But we know that there is an abundance of gold in this area, which means that this place forms a financial center, an economic center for the rest of the antique world. And it's the relationship of this territory with this political engine up in the Levant that actually shapes the economic organization of these territories, going literally from Britannia down the west coast of Africa, down to the Indus Valley, up to Siberia, and includes the entire Eurasian steppe. And it's the relationship of these territories that are actually, that a lot of the early biblical texts, particularly the books of Exodus, but most of the books actually in the Old Testament, are concerning. Now, when we talk about Egyptian and Nubian identity, initially we used to be talking about just Egyptian and then Nubian as an addition. Then we realized that they kind of run in tandem, but we're actually in a period where we've got a huge amount of evidence, huge amount of artifacts, huge amount of scholarship, and we're realizing that this is a much more significant and complex civilization and relationship than we understood initially. So I'm going to take us to the very roots of Egyptian identity. Now, in my discussion last week, I discussed the instability of the Fertile Crescent that led to the establishment of Kadesh and the disintegration of the third dynasty of Ur. And when I was describing the death of the son of Shulgi of Ur, Aram Sin, Shulgi, who's Shem in the Bible, so this would be his son. The inscription regarding his death says, we thought he'd be killed by the ox, which means about political change that he's trying to enact. They thought this would be what kind of did him in, but a scorpion bit his foot. And I explained that this actually meant that there had been some form of Egyptian intervention in the instability in the Fertile Crescent at this point. And I was referring to a man that we know of as the Scorpion King. Now, we have stuff from his burial in a place called Abydos in Egypt, which is the very first of the royal burial grounds. And in his kind of the things that we have associated with him, there's some really important bone tags. Now, it's a collection of bone tags, and each of these bone tags represents a different territory who will unite and pay tribute. Each tag represents a tribute paid to this man in recognition of the fact that he is a king, and that these people will kind of coordinate around him, and this is the very birth of Egyptian systems. Now, these tags are not only like the evidence of the roots of the vassal system, the vassal territory system that will make up Egypt, but they're also kind of a tithe and taxation system that form the basis of Egyptian governance, and they are the very earliest form of Egyptian writing. There is one particular tag that's very, very important, and it's got two mountains and a serpent and a palm tree on it, and it references this mountain at Kadesh. The serpent means royalty, the palm tree represents the date orchards that are there, and the two mountains and the direction of them from the date orchard also represents this mountain. So this indicates that this mountain has paid tribute to this man who's also kind of had to intervene in the Fertile Crescent, and somehow this has occurred during this period where what we're seeing is the consolidation of and the unification of lots of different people to become an identity and a territory that we would call Egypt. This is the very birth of Egypt. Now, when I discussed the birth of Mesopotamian civilization at Eridu, we talked about how it was a reflection of an earlier Chinese civilization at Mount Song. We talked about the fact that there was the mountain where kingship descended from heaven. We talked about the similarity between the goddess at the roots of it, who has the divine consort. This again features here. The mountain Jebel Barkal, which is in Khartoum, it's near Khartoum where two parts of the Nile meet. This mountain is at the roots of Egyptian authority for kingship throughout Egyptian civilization. It's very, very sacred. We see the beginnings of the belief system that we would recognize as Egyptian mythology. Now, Shulgi of Ur, who comes to represent Shem in the Abrahamic text, is represented in the biblical text as part of the line of Seth. This is literally a line of a priestly class, a class of priest kings. The Bible is a regulatory text for the priestly class. In Egyptian mythology, Set appears, but he appears as an agent of chaos who needs to be offset with other things to create balance. This is likely to be mythology that has emerged around this period of instability. So this is central to Egyptian systems. Now, one of the notable things about the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian governance systems is that they are an incredibly stable, almost rigid system. But they're actually a rigid system holding together very unstable alliances between all these different vassal kingdoms. And the actual history of Egypt, when you start looking at dynastic succession, is not stable at all. But at the core of it is this rigid system. And at the center, there will be this God's wife and the Pharaoh, or eventually. This is the beginnings of the Pharaoh system, and the God's wife is central. The God's wife is a new manifestation of this high priestess who is seen to have a divine consort. This is her role. This is a very senior role in governance. With the high priestesses in Ur and in China, these high priestesses would marry their brother. In Egyptian royalty, it was understood that Egyptian pharaohs would marry their sister for thousands of years, right to the Ptolemies. This is a very, very rigid system that's holding together very unstable alliances, and this becomes a problem at several stages in Egyptian history. Now, what the Scorpion King represents is a power transfer from kind of Mesopotamian dominance and the dominance of the third dynasty of Ur, and the beginnings of the rise of Egyptian dominance. And Egypt become a dominant power who literally come to dominate quite most of the Mediterranean and kind of all these territories. And it's actually, they make the same mistake that Shulgi of Ur makes that we discussed last week, which was that they begin to become different kind of strands of power emerge within, while the original kind of Egyptian identity is formed of this fusion of Mesopotamian kind of identity, the Nubian identity that's from here, and this governance system of the high priestesses from the mountains, connected by mountains across the Eurasian steppe and even the eastern steppe. What also happens is within this system, as it becomes more complex, is new identities emerge who see themselves as fully Egyptian and are threatened by these original Nubian identities or this Mesopotamian influence. One example of this is the dynasty that runs from Kamose, and I think it runs to Tutmos, or Tutmos III, and includes kind of queens, pharaohs like Hatshepsut, who's a female pharaoh. And these kind of lines come, this balancing kind of these different identities becomes a real problem in the Egyptian system. Now, when I discussed the period covered by Abraham and Sarah, where Sakiahar, the Hyksos king, not only does he have to stabilize the situation on the Fertile Crescent, and not only does he represent kind of the end of the city of Ur, but this is also a period of instability within Egypt itself. In Sakihar's inscription in Avaris, it says he subdues the Bow people. This is a reference to the Tarseti, the Nubian kind of people who, this is their identity. His power is seen to be linked to that. Now, he enters into a marriage alliance which is depicted in the Bible and in Quranic tradition as Hagar, the mother of Ishmael. She's very likely to have been a daughter of a pharaoh from this line of the Scorpion King. The first artifact that we have related to a pharaoh is called the Narmer palette. It's a cosmetic palette with iconography of like a very victorious pharaoh, which is actually directly reproduced from an earlier Akkadian kind of monument called the Naram-Sin victory stele, which I'll put underneath. This iconography is reproduced through Egyptian iconography for 5,000 years and is at the core of the, like, Narmer is very unlikely to have been the person who unified Egypt. This is likely to have taken place over several generations from the Scorpion King, but Narmer represents the birth of the pharaoh system, which means house or dynasty. This is a system which will reproduce throughout its history. Now, when you look at the Cartouche for Sakiahar, this Hyksos king, and when you look in the biblical references to Abraham, it describes him as a ruler of foreign lands. And this is very, very interesting because he does come from this Mesopotamian kind of power base. Sarah is the high priestess of Ur. What this indicates is that he, like this king, always knew that he was separate from kind of whatever allegiances he was building here. And while the kings that he represents are associated with a place called the Mountain of Anubis, where there are various tombs of various kings and pharaohs, the fact that Kadesh, this mountain, Mount Sin, is the one that he consolidates, where the ancestors are actually buried, actually suggests that there was always the intention that he would detach himself from this civilization. Now, over the course of time, Egypt becomes much more complex and it develops kind of relationships, this system of vassal states. They become much more powerful kingdoms within themselves. There are power tussles, and Egypt's kind of influence expands to include the Greek Aegean right up to Sardinia, and they're extracting tribute from people, and the Egyptian identity becomes central to their ability to subordinate other people. And dynasties emerge who are very much threatened by the Mesopotamian roots of the identity, the Nubian roots of the identity, and trouble also emerges in the people that they end up subordinating. And by the time you get to the period leading up to the Bronze Age collapse, you can see in the period of Akhenaten, who's euphemistically called the first kind of monotheistic pharaoh, that this has escalated to what has been a full-scale war on the kind of descendants of the Hyksos that has gone on for hundreds of years. And in the Amarna letters, which is a fantastic literary source that's left over from the period of Akhenaten, you can see in the letters from the Amarna period that the various vassal states and tributaries are being treated with disdain by the Egyptian pharaohs. It's these people who are described, there is descriptions in the Amarna letters of a tribal federation forming of the Habaru people, which is understood to be a precursor of the word Hebrew. The word that's found on the letter referring to Kadesh in the bone tags at Abydos is it's the J sound. It means Jew. This is actually like the stories of Exodus in the Bible will give you tremendous insight into what is going on here during the Bronze Age collapse, which takes place over several generations. Now, I'm not really interested in kind of spending a lot of time on the books of Exodus because I don't want it to get into kind of naming people in the Bible, but it's quite important in terms of the fact that Moses marries a woman who becomes the first queen of Sheba. And what this kind of symbolizes is the emergence of this Nubian identity as a nation in their own right, holding this territory that covers these gold supplies. This creates them as a separate, independent state from Egypt. She goes back to her own people. She's associated, I think probably is associated with Jebel Barkal. He also has a Midianite wife. This is likely to refer to a descendant of his father. Jethro is said to be atoning for the sins of Tubal-Cain. This is literally somebody likely to be descended from Zimri-Lin and the site at Mari. His authority as Moses, as the person who can renew this covenant at Kadesh, comes from this Queen of Sheba, who becomes the Queen of Sheba because she's emerging from kind of Egyptian subordination, and this Midianite wife who represents this site at Kadesh. This is about the emergence of this political center from under Egyptian control. It is claiming independence. Sheba is claiming independence. Now this is really, really, really important because at this point the mountain at Kadesh is consolidated and its functions are expanded. Now the finale of the Bronze Age collapse is a full-scale war called a full-scale battle called the Battle of Kadesh, where basically Ramses II, who is the Egyptian pharaoh, finds himself backed into battle, and he finds out that all his vassal states and all his allies have left him. And historians are really confused as to what happens here because it looks like a stalemate. His troops are not killed at all, but he kind of is left without allies. And it's not a stalemate, it's a breaking away of this site here that will be like, it now becomes Mount Sinai instead of Mount Sin. It becomes Jerusalem instead of Salem. And this breaking away of Sheba and this assertion of a Nubian identity, which goes on to become the economic and financial center of the antique world. And it's the interplay of these three civilizations that continues to be important. Now, the tribal federation model that is established at Kadesh and what's described in the Bible actually is a very symbolic story that will be describing a population resettlement which covers the entire Mediterranean. The sea territories of the Egyptians become the territories of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians appear to come out of nowhere, and their name means scarlet and purple. It means royal. They are likely to be an amalgamation of Minoan royalty and various people around this site at Kadesh, with Canaan, the front face, where you can go no further, as the site that will protect Kadesh. Now, as if kind of validating this, one of the very first things that happens shortly after the Battle of Kadesh is the Egyptians plunder Canaan. The books of Exodus are a very direct message to within the Egyptian system. They're a tightly coded story about the birth of the Egyptian pharaoh system. The death of the firstborn is about the fact that they have taken this identity away from Egypt. Jebel Barkal, Ramses II very quickly establishes a temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal. The Quranic passages in the cave regarding Moses discuss the hauling of boats, which refers to the sea people, and discuss, there's a really obscure bit that says that Satan made me forget about the fish and it swam away. And it's basically describing power transferring from Jebel Barkal and the kind of rivers at the Nile to this site where the two waters meet, that's referencing Kadesh, Mount Sinai, the holy mountain. In the Josephus histories, what you see then is that within this site at Kadesh, like extra taxation and tithe systems, one for welfare, one for festivals, one for gathering, is actually implemented. The book of Leviticus is a codification of religious practices from a wide variety of groups and civilizations who have come together under the banner of the Sea People, most of them ex-Egyptian vassal states, but also peoples from around the Mediterranean, including the Minoans and the Hittites. And it's actually about a codification of core religious practices that they are all agreed on, that will be centered around this site, Mount Sinai, the holy mountain. From that point on, it's actually the tandem development, it's the tandem working of this economic center that is represented by the Queen of Sheba, this source of the antique world's gold, and this political engine and their relationship not just with Egypt but with other civilizations, that goes on to shape the antique world. From the Phoenicians, the Carthaginian Empire emerges, and they literally dominate right up until about 176 BC, and I'm talking about quite like most of Europe, as well as what Christopher Beckwith describes as the Eurasian culture complex, the different civilizations who emerged from the Eurasian steppe, the descendants of Ham, Japheth and Shem. This is the entire Eurasian steppe. This is most of Europe, Egypt and Africa. Like, this is a massive variety of territories. But at the center of it is this financial center that we call ancient Nubia, and this political engine in the Levant. And what I'm going to discuss in the next video is the point in time where this political engine starts to disintegrate, which is depicted in the stories of Solomon, and the instability that eventually leads to both these civilizations, Egypt and Nubia, entering a new phase in their history, which is where they come under the control of foreign powers. Now, one of the things that I've tried really hard not to do in this video, because I want to talk about the development of economic systems, is get to the point where it's all about who Lisa names in the Bible, because I just think it distracts from that actual analysis. But if you do want a video about how to identify the various people, including kind of Moses and Miriam and all these people in the biblical stories, they're actually very easy to identify, and I'm happy to do that. But in the next video, I'm going to discuss the period where both Egypt and the Nubia come under the control of foreign powers, right up to the modern day. And then next week I'm going to come back and start to look at the other civilizations who are joined around Kadesh and around this political agreement and economic center, and we're going to start to look at the territories that are covered by modern day Turkey. Thank you very much for listening to me today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll see you in the next video.